The forest was not meant to remember names, yet on that night it remembered everything. The wind carried whispers older than the trees themselves, and the soil, dark and damp, waited in silence. Somewhere beyond the edge of civilization, where maps grew vague and laws lost their meaning, 5 men followed a single trail. They were armed, confident, and convinced of their purpose. They believed the wilderness belonged to them just as surely as the woman they hunted. They believed she would break before dawn. They were wrong. She had no name that history cared to preserve. The records would later call her a black slave, as if that explained her existence, as if it stripped her of fear, memory, or will. But she had once been a child who laughed, a daughter who remembered her mother's voice, a woman who knew the smell of rain before it fell. On that night, she was running not just for her freedom, but for her right to remain alive. Her escape had not been planned. It had erupted from desperation, from a moment when the weight of chains became heavier than the fear of the unknown. The plantation lay behind her, quiet in the dark, its fences and fields resting like a sleeping beast. Ahead of her stretched the wild, dense woods that even the masters avoided after sunset. She ran barefoot, thorns tearing at her skin, branches clawing at her dress, breath burning in her chest. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stop. When the alarm was raised, it did not take long for men to gather. 5 of them volunteered, some for reward, some for pride, some for the cruel thrill of pursuit. They carried rifles, ropes, and lanterns. They joked as they entered the forest, their laughter cutting through the night. To them, this was not a rescue or a duty. It was a hunt. They spoke of her as if she were already caught, already returned, already punished. The forest swallowed them whole. Lantern light danced against tree trunks, creating shadows that stretched and twisted like living things. The deeper they went, the quieter they became. The woods did not welcome them. It pressed in from all sides, thick with undergrowth and unseen movement. Every snapped twig sounded too loud. Every rustle felt deliberate. She had stopped running by then. Exhaustion forced her to crouch beneath a fallen tree, her body shaking, her ears straining to separate real sound from imagined ones. She heard them before she saw them. Voices, boots, metal brushing against branches. Fear surged through her, sharp and paralyzing, but something else rose with it. Anger, resolve, a clarity that came from knowing there would be no mercy if she was found. She had grown up near these woods. As a child, she had been warned about snakes, about sinkholes, about paths that vanished without warning. She remembered which plants burned the skin and which soothed it. She remembered where the ground softened after rain and where it turned treacherous. This forest was not a mystery to her. It was a danger, yes, but it was a danger she understood. The men split up, confident that numbers guaranteed success. They called out to one another, their voices echoing and overlapping. One laughed nervously, complaining that the woods felt wrong. Another told him to stop talking nonsense. None of them noticed the way the sounds changed, how the forest absorbed their noise and gave nothing back. She moved silently, her breathing controlled, her steps measured. She circled them instead of fleeing straight ahead. She waited, watching from behind trees thick enough to hide her shape. When one man strayed, too far from the others, she followed his lantern, keeping to the shadows. He moved carelessly, certain that a woman alone posed no threat. He never saw her hand reach for the branch he tripped over. He fell hard, the lantern shattering, plunging him into darkness. His shout was short, cut off by the forest depth. When the others called his name, there was no answer. Only the sound of insects and the distant creak of trees. Panic crept in quietly. The men regrouped, their bravado fading. They told themselves accidents happened, that he would catch up, but the forest had shifted. Paths they thought they remembered twisted into unfamiliar shapes. The air grew heavier, the night darker. She watched them argue, watched fear creep into their eyes. She felt no triumph, only grim necessity. She knew if even one of them reached the plantation, others would come. Dogs, guns, Fire. This had to end here. Another man wandered off, following what he thought was movement. He stepped into ground softened by a hidden stream. His foot sank, then the other. He struggled, cursing, but panic only pulled him deeper. His shouts faded into gurgles as the mud claimed him. The forest closed over the disturbance, smooth and indifferent. By the time the remaining three realized something was terribly wrong, dawn still lay hours away. Their lantern oil ran low. Their confidence had evaporated. They began to speak of turning back, but the way behind them no longer made sense. Every direction looked the same. She stayed just out of sight, a presence they could feel but never see. A snap branch here, a shadow there. Fear does strange things to the mind. It makes men see what they dread. It makes them doubt each other. One accused another of playing tricks. Voices rose. A gun went off by mistake, the sound exploding through the forest like thunder. Birds burst into the air. Silence followed, thick and absolute. When they realized one of their own lay bleeding, shot by a friend's trembling hand, something broke inside them. The forest did not rush. It waited. The wounded man did not last long. Infection would have claimed him eventually, but fear hastened the end. The others left him behind, unable to carry him, unable to listen to his cries. They told themselves they would return. They never did. By the time only two remained, the night felt endless. Their hands shook. Their steps faltered. They were no longer hunters. They were lost men, stumbling through a world that rejected them. When one vanished without a sound, the other did not even shout. He ran, blindly, straight into a ravine hidden by darkness. Morning came softly. Light filtered through the trees, illuminating a forest that looked peaceful, unchanged. Buisson. Dew clung to leaves. There was no sign of struggle, no clear trail of what had happened. The woods kept its secrets well. She emerged slowly, her body aching, her skin marked by scratches and bruises. She did not celebrate. She did not cry. She simply stood, breathing in the air of a world that for the first time did not have a hand around her throat. She walked away from that place before the sun climbed too high. She knew others might come. She knew freedom was not guaranteed. But she had survived a night meant to erase her. The forest had not saved her out of kindness. It had merely allowed her to fight on her own terms. When the plantation realized the men had not returned, stories spread quickly. Some said the slave had been killed by wild animals. Others whispered of curses, of spirits angered by blood spilled on sacred ground. No one spoke of her skill, her courage, her will. It was easier to blame the woods than to admit a truth that challenged everything they believed. Years later, the forest still stood. Trees grew where men had vanished. Roots wrapped around forgotten bones. The land did not judge. It remembered. History would reduce the event to a rumor, a footnote, a warning told in half-formed sentences. 5 men went into the wild. None returned. The woman they hunted disappeared, her fate unknown. But in the quiet places where the trees lean close and the ground feels alive beneath your feet, the story never truly ended. Because some nights, when the wind moves just right, the forest seems to whisper not of violence, but of survival. Of a woman who refused to die quietly. Of hunters who learned too late that power does not belong to those who claim it, but to those who endure. And the woods, unchanged and eternal, still stands as the only true witness. The days that followed did not bring peace. Survival never ends at dawn. It only changes shape. She moved deeper into the wilderness, away from the place where fear still clung to the trees like mist. Every sound made her pause. Every distant call of a bird felt like a warning. Freedom, she learned quickly, was not a single moment of escape, but a series of careful choices made while exhausted and alone. Hunger arrived before safety did. Her body, already weakened by years of labor, now demanded food she did not know how to find easily. She ate berries she recognized, roots she had once seen elders gather, and whatever small creatures she could trap with shaking hands. Each meal was small, but it kept her moving. At night, she slept in short bursts, never deeply, never without listening. She avoided paths, even animal trails, knowing that anything easy to follow could be used against her. She crossed streams to erase her scent, doubled back when the ground grew too open, and learned to move when the forest itself was loud with wind or rain. She was no longer running blindly. She was thinking like someone who intended to live. Far behind her, confusion turned into fear, and fear into anger. The disappearance of 5 men could not be ignored. The plantation owner sent others to search, men who did not laugh as they entered the woods, men who carried dogs and spoke less. They found nothing, no bodies, no clear tracks, only a forest that refused to explain itself. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said the men had turned on each other. Some claimed wild animals had dragged them away. A few whispered that the woman was not human at all, that she had made a pact with something ancient and unseen. Those whispers revealed more about the people telling them than about her. It was easier to invent monsters than to accept resistance. She felt the search before she ever saw it. The distant barking of dogs carried on the wind, low and threatening. Panic threatened to undo all her careful planning. Dogs had ended many escapes. She climbed, forcing herself up into a tree whose branches hid her shape. She waited, muscles burning, as the sound passed beneath her and moved on. When she climbed down hours later, her hands were numb, but she was alive. Each narrow escape hardened her. Fear became something she could fold and carry instead of something that ruled her. She learned the rhythm of the forest, when it was safest to move, when to disappear. She began to believe, not without disbelief of her own, that she might actually succeed. Weeks passed. Her body changed. Weight fell away, leaving lean strength behind. Old scars faded into new ones. Her thoughts turned quieter, sharper. She no longer thought of herself only as someone fleeing. She began to think of herself as someone choosing. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in dull red, she reached the edge of unfamiliar land. The forest thinned. Smoke rose in the distance, faint but unmistakable. People lived there. The knowledge terrified her more than the woods ever had. People could betray. People could sell her back. People could smile and destroy her with the same breath. She watched from a distance, learning before approaching. She saw a small settlement, rough cabins, tired faces. These were not plantation fields. These were poor folk surviving rather than owning. Still, trust was a risk she could not afford lightly. She waited until night and approached the outskirts. A woman saw her first, froze, then slowly lowered the bucket she was holding. There was a long moment where nothing moved. No shouting, no silencers, just 2 women studying each other across the weight of history. The older woman spoke quietly, asked no questions that demanded answers, offered water first, food second, shelter last. Each gesture was careful, deliberate. Trust, she seemed to understand, had to be earned from both sides. For the first time since she ran, she slept indoors. Not deeply, not peacefully, but without leaves pressed against her skin or roots beneath her back. When she woke, the world had not ended. No one had turned her in. No chains waited at the door. Days turned into weeks again. She worked when she could, stayed hidden when she had to. Her story remained mostly unspoken. People did not ask, and she did not offer. Silence protected her better than truth. Yet even here, the past lingered. News traveled slowly but surely. 5 men missing. A runaway never found. Some nights, she woke convinced she heard boots again, convinced the forest had followed her. But life, stubborn and persistent, continued. She learned new skills. She found moments of quiet laughter. She discovered that survival could slowly turn into something else, something dangerously close to hope. The woods remained behind her, unchanged, holding its secrets. Somewhere among those trees lay the end of 5 men who believed power guaranteed safety. Somewhere else walked a woman who had learned that endurance was its own kind of strength. History would never record her name. It would never give her a monument or a date to mark her victory. But survival itself became her testimony. Every breath she took in freedom rewrote the ending they had planned for her. And long after the rumors faded, long after the forest reclaimed every trace, the truth remained simple and unsettling. 5 men chased a black slave into the wild, certain they would return. They never did. She did. Time did not erase the danger. It only softened its edges. Even in that small settlement, even among people who minded their own suffering, she understood one truth clearly. The world she had escaped still existed, and it would never willingly forget her. Slave catchers did not stop searching because hope faded. They stopped only when profit disappeared. Until then, every unfamiliar face was a question mark, every distant rider a threat. She changed her name, then changed it again. Names were fragile things. She learned which details of herself to hide and which to reshape. She kept her head down, spoke little, listened more. People assumed what they wanted to assume. A poor woman passing through. A widow. A relative who had lost her family. None of those stories were safe, but they were safer than the truth. At night, the memories returned uninvited. The lantern light between trees. The sound of boots crushing leaves. The moment she realized fear could be used as a weapon. She did not dream of killing, yet death walked through her sleep anyway, silent and unavoidable. When she woke, her hands sometimes shook, not with guilt, but with the echo of how close she had come to being erased. She wondered, more than once, whether the forest had changed her in ways she could never undo. Survival had demanded choices that polite history preferred not to acknowledge. But whenever doubt rose, she remembered the certainty of what would have happened if she had been caught. Doubt had no power against that clarity. Seasons shifted. Leaves turned, fell, returned. With each passing month, the story of the 5 men faded further into rumor. New tragedies replaced old ones. New injustices demanded attention. This was how the world worked. It moved forward without pausing to count who had been crushed beneath it. She moved again, never staying long enough to be remembered too clearly. In some places she worked fields. In others she cleaned, cooked, stitched. Each task added a small layer between her and the past. She learned to read faces, to sense danger before it announced itself. Fear had sharpened her instincts into something almost precise. Once, she saw a group of armed men pass through a town where she had planned to stay longer. They spoke openly, carelessly, of rewards and runaways. She left before sunrise, heart pounding, feet already aching with the knowledge that safety was temporary by design. Not all encounters were threats. There were moments of quiet kindness that surprised her. A meal shared without questions. A blanket offered without expectation. A look that said, without words, you are seen. These moments did not erase the cruelty she had known, but they complicated it. They reminded her that the world was not made of a single shape. As years passed, her story became something she carried differently. It no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a scar, strong and permanent. She spoke of it only once, late one night, to someone who had earned her trust through patience rather than promises. She did not dramatize it. She did not soften it. When she finished, there was a long silence. The other person did not ask how she felt about it. They simply said they were glad she was still alive. That was enough. Elsewhere, the forest remained. Trees fell, new ones rose. Hunters entered for game and returned without incident, never knowing what had happened beneath those same branches years before. The land did not advertise its history. It never does. But sometimes, when storms rolled and suddenly, or paths seemed to vanish without reason, people remembered the old story. 5 men, 1 woman, no return. The tale shifted with each telling. Some versions painted her as something unnatural. Others framed the men as fools undone by arrogance. Very few spoke of slavery itself as the true violence at the center of it all. That omission was not accidental. It never is. She lived long enough to hear whispers of change. Laws debated. Wars fought. Words like freedom spoken louder than before. None of it felt simple. None of it felt complete. But she watched the world bend, slowly, painfully, in a direction it had once sworn it never would. When she grew older, movement became harder. Running was no longer an option she relied on. Instead, she relied on the quiet authority of someone who had already faced death and refused to follow. There was power in that, even if the world did not name it. She never returned to the forest. Some places served their purpose once and should not be asked for more. In her mind, it remained exactly as it had been that night, suspended in darkness and breath and decision. A place where fear had met resolve and lost. If history had been honest, it might have said this. 5 men chased a black slave into the wild, armed with certainty and entitlement. None returned because they believed the lie that power always wins. One woman survived because she understood the truth that endurance adapts. But history is rarely honest in plain words. So the story lived instead in murmurs, in cautionary glances, in the uneasy feeling some people had when entering deep woods at night. It lived in the knowledge that sometimes the hunted do not exist merely to be caught. And somewhere, far from plantations and forests alike, a woman lived out her days under a name that was hers alone, carrying a past the world never officially recorded, and a future she had taken for herself, one dangerous step at a time. In the final years of her life, the world around her looked nothing like the one she had fled. The sound of chains no longer followed her steps, yet their memory never fully loosened its grip. Freedom, she learned, did not mean forgetting. It meant living despite remembrance. She lived quietly, deliberately. There were no grand declarations, no speeches, no attempts to correct the record of history. She understood something most never would. Survival itself was a form of resistance powerful enough to outlast lies. Every morning she woke without permission from another human being was proof that the hunt had failed. Sometimes, when the air turned heavy and the wind moved through trees in a certain way, her thoughts returned to that night. Not with pride, not with regret, but with a sober awareness of how thin the line between life and erasure truly was. She remembered the fear most of all, not the kind that weakens, but the kind that sharpens, that forces the mind to choose clarity over collapse. She never spoke of revenge. What happened in the woods was not vengeance. It was consequence, the natural result of cruelty chasing certainty into a place where certainty could not survive. The men had believed the world would bend for them, as it always had. The forest taught them otherwise. As her hair turned gray, younger people sometimes asked her how she had endured so much. She never gave dramatic answers. She said only that she kept moving when stopping meant death, and she learned to listen when the world spoke softly. Those who understood nodded. Those who didn't moved on. When she finally passed, there were no records that mark her importance. No stone carved with her story. No official acknowledgement of what she had survived. History, as it often does, chose silence. But silence does not mean absence. Some truths refuse to disappear simply because they are inconvenient. They linger in places untouched by ink and paper. They live in forests that feel heavier at night, in warnings parents cannot quite explain, in the unease that settles over arrogance when it steps too confidently into the unknown. 5 men chased a black slave into the wild, believing power would carry them home. It did not. What returned instead was a story stripped of names, but heavy with meaning. A reminder that oppression is not invincible, that even in the darkest places, resolve can outlast force. The forest still stands. The world still changes slowly. And somewhere within history's long silence lives the truth of a woman who refused to disappear when the world decided she should. That is where the story ends. Not with justice served by courts or laws, but with survival claimed by will. And sometimes that is the most dangerous ending of all.